Hello, and welcome to today's QDU Academy session. Today, we're going to be looking at the round one topic for grade 11 for 2025, and sorry that it says 2024, but it is 2025, and that topic is that as the feminist movement, we would actively advocate for men working in traditionally female industries. In this session, we're going to cover a few things. We're going to go over debate context, which is sort of the reasons why this debate is taking place, things that I think are useful to research before getting stuck into the topic. Then we're going to go over setup. Then we're going to go over brainstorming some points and a couple of tips also about POIs towards the end. But the very first thing we're going to cover actually is actor debates, because this is one. The first thing to know is, what is an actor debate? An actor debate is a topic that is from the perspective of a specific individual or group, rather than being from the perspective of society. And we can see in this topic, it is that as the feminist movement, as opposed to that in general, we would advocate for this. So the reason why this is important is that there is a couple of things. Firstly, it means that the very important thing to do is to work out, what does the actor care about? Because the topic is not going to be won and lost based on what is good for society necessarily, although sometimes it may. It is based on what is in the interests of the actor specifically. And yes, sometimes those interests will align with society more broadly, but not necessarily. And so that's why these topics are quite interesting. The second thing here is that in terms of modeling, and we'll get to this in a bit, you are again modeling from the perspective of an actor, which means that you do not necessarily have governmental power to do a policy. You have the power of the actor to do as much as the actor can do. So, in terms of what you should keep in mind at the beginning of this, it is that this debate is going to be from the perspective of the feminist movement. And what is going to win the debate is which team can prove that this is good specifically for them. Hopefully that will align with society, but if it doesn't, you are going to win from their perspective. And that's something I'm going to keep on coming back to throughout this entire presentation, because that is basically the only thing that changes, but it's a big thing to miss. And everything else about these debates operates in the same way as a normal policy debate in most cases. You just need to keep in mind the fact that it is from the perspective of the individual when you're doing everything: points, impacting, rebuttal, all of that. So let's now get into context. Fortunately, context changes almost not at all. You're still just trying to work out, what is this debate about? The questions that I thought of for this particular topic is, firstly, in reference to the actor specifically, what is the feminist movement? What are its goals? This is important because this topic, the actor often is like a really clear individual or organization that has a clear capacity to act. The concept of the feminist movement is a bit more broad and vague, in that it definitely exists, but it's not really something that people like carry a membership card for. And so instead, you're sort of working out, what do we think is clearly something that has been representative of the goals of the feminist movement in the past, in terms of trying to work this out. But that's the very first thing. The next thing I wrote down is, what industries are traditionally female dominated? Importantly, there's two reasons why this is important. The first is the context of it being traditionally female dominated, which means that this debate is not going to be about industries such as the law, where most graduates currently are women, but traditionally the industry has been male dominated, and there's just sort of a cultural shift away from that at the moment. But the second reason why this is important is that it's something you just want a list of examples of. You don't want to spend the entire debate and only ever reference one example. Partly because there's a chance that different examples will interact slightly differently with the debate, and you'll be able to diversify your points. But even if you can't do that, it's just good practice to be able to name multiple examples of the premise of the entire topic. The last thing I wrote down here, I think this is the last thing, is just the counter to this. Which industries are male dominated? Because even though those industries are not necessarily the ones in the topic, they are going to be implicitly affected. Let's now move on to defining the topic, which I skipped to slightly early, but that's okay. Again, these topics work the same way in terms of definitions. Although what I'll say is that you're now in year 11. I don't really think you need a definition by itself. I think getting a definition by itself works when you are otherwise not going to talk about the words in the topic really clearly. I think that anything that is worth defining, you're probably going to need to model anyway, and your model is going to be the more important thing. but I'll cover words that it's worth having a definition of in case that's something that you personally find useful. And there's nothing wrong with that, it's just personally I wouldn't. First thing, oh, this is just the word as. The reason this is important is that this is what defines the fact that it is an active debate. Secondly, advocate for. Again, this is a verb, which means you're about to model it, but still define what it means to advocate for it. The reason why this is significant, and I'll get to this a bit more in modeling on the next slide, is that you can't magic people into these jobs. At best, you can just advocate for them to choose that. You're trying to manipulate people's choices rather than force them. And so keep that in mind, and just like defining what a female-dominated industry is, because there has to be a cutoff at some point. Let's now look at stances. The reason I've written stance as opposed to model is that actor debates, they sort of modify anything else. You can have an actor debate that is also a policy debate, which is like this one, and those come in the form of that as X we would. It doesn't have the word should, but it still works the same way. But sometimes you'll have an actor debate that is actually a regret debate, and it will be that as X we regret Y. And so I've written stance just to remind you that sort of actor debates modify whatever else happens to be there. In this case, it is a model, and that's why that's relevant here. But the big thing here is that because you're not passing a government policy, you're explaining the actions that a group of people will take. You want to just sort of here give examples of what kinds of things you think the feminist movement can do to advocate for this, and how you think that's likely to play out. Just to sort of give some clarity of how you're going to do the topic. As the negative team, you can also have a counter model or counter stance in a actor debate. That's totally reasonable. What I'd suggest here, though, is make sure that it's something that cannot coexist at the same time. For example, you can advocate for many other things, but you need to prove why it's kind of inconsistent with advocating for this. So I think the cleanest model is just sort of advocating for women in these industries or something like that to try and like preserve that. Or you do not need to advocate for anything. You could say that actually we'd rather just be on the side of like choice more broadly, and we wouldn't specifically try and pressure people into any specific career. But just keep in mind that that is something that you can make a choice about in terms of your stance. The next thing is point ideas. Point ideas are important because you're going to need to link everything quite specifically back to the actor, which means that you should go through the same kind of brainstorming process as you normally would in terms of how many individuals or groups or things are going to be affected by this, can I think of, and how are they going to be affected? Why is this good or bad? But you're going to need to tie it back to why the actor will care. So, for example, if you can prove that this is really bad for like a group of people that you think the feminist movement probably hates, it's not going to be a very compelling point. It's going to be most persuasive if you can prove that the feminist movement themselves are going to care about it a lot. This is also true if you're thinking of running some kind of principled argument in an actor debate. Principled arguments will only work in an actor debate if you can prove that the actor is going to care about that principle and they're going to feel bad about the fact that they're violating it. So the key thing here is go through your normal brainstorming process, but make sure that when you're considering, is this point worthwhile? Is it worth investing the time to actually write it? You think, is there a way that we can prove that the actor cares about it? The other way that you might want to go about brainstorming for this point, for this topic, is to think, and this works for all actor debates, is to think, how many things can I think of that the actor is going to care about, and then try and come up with a point that relates back to each of them. So you might think for this debate, feminist movement probably cares about, firstly, like political change. From both sides, think, does this increase their ability to get political change? They probably care about like women's rights in the workplace. Does this policy increase or decrease the likelihood of achieving that? The usefulness of this is that it's really easy to tie it back to the actor because that's how you thought of it in the first place. The downside of this is that it increases the risk that your points are a bit repetitive because often the interests overlap quite a bit. You're more likely to think of very unique points if you think of different stakeholders, but you need to do more legwork to prove their relevance to the specific topic. So keep that in mind. That doesn't mean that either way is specifically better or worse. In fact, maybe you should just do both because you'll brainstorm the most that way. But that's just two suggestions that I can come up with for this. In terms of, this is POIs. Before I talk about POIs, I'm just going to briefly touch on structuring arguments, of which there's nothing particularly new to talk about, except for the fact I'd suggest that make sure that you delegate a bit of time at the end of each of your points to explain why it's relevant to the actor. Moving on to POIs, which I believe most of you will be new unless you were doing year 11 debating last year anyway. I'm going to start by going through the rules, then going through the strategies of POIs. And this is the last thing in this particular video. So let's start with the rules. Firstly, what are POIs? They are questions that you ask to the other team during their speeches. When do you ask them? Between the first and the 7th minute of the speaker's speech. There will be a bell at 1 minute. After that bell, you can start offering POIs. There will be a bell at 7 minutes. After that point, you can offer no more POIs. How many should you accept? You should try and accept exactly 2 in your speech. Try not to accept fewer, and there's no obligation to accept more. There's no sort of bonus points for it. So try and accept 2. That means that you're trying to get the other team to accept 2 as well. And you should do that by, I think, trying to offer at least 2 per speaker per speaker. So each member of your team should try and offer each member of the other team 2 POIs for a minimum of about 6 per speaker. In total, and this will give them ample chances to accept POIs at times that work for them, and it reduces the risk that you'll not get accepted enough. Who can offer POIs? Everyone can offer POIs to everyone. More rules of POIs. You should try and keep your POIs to about 15 seconds. More than that is a bit sort of unfair to the speaker that you're interrupting. And your POI responses, you should also try and keep fairly brief. It's totally okay to have a long POI response, but I think usually you should try and keep it a bit brief. The reason for this is that it's what the other team wants you to talk about. So unless you think that you're sort of like actively gaining ground through it, you're probably just sort of rebutting something and mitigating a harm. So it's not worth investing a ton of time. The easy way to think about this, I think, is that in year 10, your speeches are 7 minutes long. In year 11 and year 12, your speeches are 8 minutes long, but you also have POIs. If POIs are taking up more than a minute of your speech, you've actually got less time to deliver your speech than you would last year. And that's probably bad. So you should try and keep your engagement with POIs to be about a minute of your speech, I think, unless you think that you're actively sort of gaining a lot of ground through responding to them. Let's move on to strategies with POIs. Oh, sorry, one more thing, which is how do you accept a POI? When you get offered a POI, there are 3 responses you can give. The first is you can say no thank you, in which case that speaker will then sit down and they will not ask that POI. You can say yes please, they will offer that POI, you will then respond to it. Or you can say something along the lines of I'll take that in a second, I'll take that in a minute, basically highlighting that you are about to take the POI but you would like to finish your sentence or you'd like to finish your thought before you do so. All of those are totally reasonable, and they operate in that way. Things that mean the same thing as that, also totally fine. Strategies. I think that there are probably 3 things that you should keep in mind with POIs in terms of the purposes. The first purpose of POIs is to sort of clarify something that you don't understand. If the other team is saying something and you think it doesn't make sense, in the sense that you are struggling to work out what they mean for your own sake in rebuttal, you should try and clarify it. This is particularly important if they don't mention something in their model and you think that the debate works really, really differently depending on their answer and you don't want to get it wrong. You should POI them so that you can get clarification. The significance of this to keep in mind is trying to make the other team clarify their case usually will make their case shockingly clearer, and that's good for them. It's good for you if it also means that you understand them better and you feel more comfortable in rebuttal, but you don't want to sort of needlessly make their case stronger if you do already understand it. But it's better to understand the other team's case well so that you can rebut really well than not understand it at all and sound really confused in your rebuttal. So that's the sort of one thing to keep in mind that you can do with POIs, but I think it's the least sort of devastating. It causes the least damage to the other team. The 2 ways that I think you can cause a lot of damage to the other team are, firstly, use POIs to talk about your case. You can use POIs. POIs do not need to be about what the other team is currently talking about. So one use of POIs, for example, is if, let's say, the first negative speaker is speaking, you POI something that is part of your argumentation for your 2.1 at second affirmative. And the usefulness of this is it sort of introduces your point into the debate a bit early, but they're sort of forced to rebut it before they fully understand the point in full. And this will make you have sort of a chance to sort of enter the debate earlier with this point catches them off guard. It's also presumably your points are good for your team, in which case they spend time talking about something that's not likely to be strategic for them. You can also do this instead of being before you say it, after you say it. Let's say that you have like part of your first speaker speech, first affirmative, and first and second negative don't really respond to it. You might POI third negative and basically say, at first speaker, we told you this. Could you please give your team sort of first response to this? Whilst this might initially seem unstrategic because you're basically telling them to rebut something that they haven't rebutted yet, and their rebuttal might be good, it does carry the benefit that it highlights to the adjudicator that you understand that your point hasn't been responded to, and that you think your point is quite strong. And rebuttal at third neg given to first affirmative is like somewhat unpersuasive at times because affirmative doesn't have an ability to respond back. So sometimes it can be useful to do that, although it's probably unstrategic to try and like get, I don't know, a second negative to rebut second affirmative. It's like they'll probably do that anyway, and there's not much of a benefit. Like the adjudicator already understands your point pretty well. It was just said. But there can be some benefit there. The other purpose of POIs is to like try and talk about the other team's case. This is where you sort of package rebuttal up as a POI, and you can totally do that as well. Again, it can be a useful way to engage with the debate when you're not giving rebuttal. If you're a first speaker, I mean, you should usually be trying to pass rebuttal notes to your teammates anyway, but you might, for example, realize that they're busy writing something and you want to participate in the debate and you offer a POI that's designed to sort of rebut part of their argument. The two pieces of advice I'd give here are firstly, make sure your POIs are worded as questions. But secondly, it does not have to be about specifically what the other team is talking about right now, as long as it has relevance to the debate in general. The last thing I'll just note here is POIs are really difficult to explain in abstract because they are so circumstantial depending on what exactly is happening in the debate. When there's uncertainty, like as in any sort of example of a really good POI I've heard is only going to make sense if I explain all of the context of like how the debate played out before and after that point, which is a bit of a time sink, and also you'll like no two debates are exactly the same. One POI could be really good in one circumstance, but actually quite weak in another. The big advice I give is that especially when you're new to POIs, you'll get a lot of credit just for having a go. And as the season progresses, you'll sort of get the pattern recognition to understand what points seem to have been working, what points seem to have not been working as well. In the same way that you can do the same thing with arguments, and you can sort of identify, if I ask a POI like this, the team seems to be very confident at rebutting me pretty quickly, but they're a lot slower at responding, or they respond in a less convincing way if I word it like this. And it means that you know that that's a strategy you can use in your next debate. Thank you very much for sitting through all of this. If you have any questions, or if you have like notes on anything that you think I didn't really talk about a lot, I know I didn't really talk about rebuttal a lot or point structure in this particular presentation, there's a good chance I covered it in a decent bit of depth in one of the similar videos from last year, which obviously won't be on the same topics, but hopefully have similar thoughts, and they'll cover different things in more depth depending on how important they are to that particular debate. This one focused a lot on actor debates and POIs because I know that stuff's new, but other stuff is new in other weeks as well. So feel free to have a look for those. You'll find them all on the YouTube channel, which I assume that you know about given that you're already watching this video. But best of luck for this debate. Best of luck for all of your debates in the future. Hope you're enjoying debating. See you around at debating.